All right, well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Data First Forum, Demystifying DSPM. I'm Ashley Spinelli, Senior Customer Marketing Manager here at Varonis, and we are thrilled to have you with us today. Today, we are pleased as punch to bring you Robert Blythe, VP Information Security and Technology Risk Management from World Wrestling Entertainment. Robert, would you like to say hello?
Yes, thank you for having me.
Yes, I'm very happy you're here. Next slide here. Robert will be chatting with our very own Matt Radilak, who is Senior Director of Incident Response and Cloud Operations. Matt is also a staple on the Data First Forum and our State of Cybercrime webinars. Say hello, Matt.
Hey, Ashley, thanks for having me back on another Data First Forum. Really excited.
Excellent. And we also have a surprise guest joining us, Ryan O'Boyle, who is our Senior Manager of Cloud Solutions. Doesn't have a slide, but we're super happy to have him here. Ryan, say hi.
Hey, folks, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah. All right, so now we're going to talk through the agenda quickly, and then we'll get right into it. But we're going to hear more about Robert's role at WWE and how he leverages Varonis to manage risk. We'll talk about DSPM and what it means to our guests and how Gartner defines this emerging market. We'll talk about collaboration risk and how more and more sharing is leaving permissions in the hands of end users. We'll talk about the delicate balance between security and productivity and tips for security leaders managing it, plus practical advice for maturing your own program. Then we'll give away prizes. And you'll have a chance to ask Robert, Matt, and Ryan your own questions live in the Q&A window. So as things come up, make sure you're putting them in the Q&A window. If they go in the chat, they might get lost, and we want to answer those questions. So with that, I'll hand things over to Matt to get us started.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thanks to everybody in our audience for joining us today. I just want to kick things off by giving you guys a quick intro to Bob. Bob's got over 30 years of experience in the information technology and security space. He's been leading the cybersecurity capabilities for over a decade and leads the information security division for WWE. His responsibilities include cybersecurity operations, threat intelligence, cybersecurity engineering, information security and governance, data protection, data privacy, compliance, technology, risk management, and he's always focused on continuing to mature his organization's cybersecurity posture. And Bob, just to dive right into it, the first question I'd have for you is, could you tell us a little bit about your career path and maybe in your own words, what else you're responsible for in your role today?
Yeah, sure, Matthew. Thank you. So I've been in the field for about 34 years now. Started in traditional IT back when the first IBM PC came out, rolled through my journey on Windows, Novell, rolled into Microsoft as it became a force to be reckoned with in the market. Moved as a consultant for 15 years, been with WWE now going on 20 years, played multiple roles here. That's including Director of Infrastructure, as well as operations, established the cybersecurity division, moved into an information security leader, and I oversee the areas that you mentioned.
Yeah, wow. And it's really an honor for us to have you here today. One of the things that we've seen change a lot is the threat landscape. We've seen that businesses are adapting to different threats, especially as we see, over the last few years, this hyper focus on collaboration and sharing. So as a security leader, how do you think about your program evolving to meet these new challenges?
So I mean, you have your traditional controls that you want to put in place, traditional IT controls, firewalls, IDS, IPS, you have your endpoint protection, you have your EDR services, your vulnerability and patch management, all wrapped around what we call your security posture. With the changing landscape, I would say probably about 10 years ago when it became like a cloud first approach, being agile, leveraging Google, Box, Dropbox, Office 365, your data really kind of left your four walls, your castle and moat approach, where you would keep it on either on a private cloud in the NAS, a soft NAS, or maybe a physical NAS within your data center. With all that changing, it's opened up what I would consider new attack paths or surface attack, where we're putting the onus into the end user's hands of how to store, process, how to access and how to grant permissions to, as well as share externally data. So the scope of your typical security, where you're just worried about your data center and protecting your data center, now the perimeter is gone. It's now in the cloud. With so many third-party vendors, data can be anywhere, and that's probably one of the biggest concerns I feel that security professionals struggle with.
And one of the things you mentioned a lot there is this sort of invisible tension between productivity and security. How do you help your organization balance that, like the needs of the business to get to information and use it, and the, your needs and likely the needs of your business to secure that information in the same process?
So what we do here is the Information Security Division actually partners across the organization. So we partner with all business units. We partner with all the technology teams. Cybersecurity does not dictate what can and cannot be used. We do have the responsibility of identifying risk and what I would say layer security on top of it. So if an organization is looking at a new storage solution, what risks come with that solution? And then what security controls can you put in place? When we're talking about data, obviously we use several industry terms like principle of least privilege, need to know. But there's always concerns of over permissioning, sharing of external data. And then you start wrapping into around what kind of data? Is it business confidential? Is it compliance-based data? GDPR, UK-DPA, CPRA. In addition, there's some more states coming out with regulations. Organizations are also struggling with PHI, under HIPAA. Typically, if you're a PCI DSS shop, you have control over that, but there's also a lot of organizations that will have corporate credit cards or personal credit cards or executive credit cards. You want to make sure that you have all that kind of confidential data under control. But first, what you need is you have to understand where it is and who's accessing it.
And I think everything that you're talking about is why this new market got created, DSPM. And I'd like to maybe launch our first poll here and ask our audience, what does DSPM stand for? We'll give everybody a second to answer there, and then we'll have our host share the results. And while we're doing that, I just want to remind everybody that we are going to take some time at the end to answer questions that come up in the Q&A. So if you've got something burning and you want to ask myself or Ryan or our guest star here, feel free to throw that into the Q&A. So host, what do people think? What is this DSPM thing and what does it stand for? Well, I got data security program management, data security posture management, data security privacy management, and data security posture mapping. Well, it looks like you guys got it right. About 125 people said data security posture management, and that is exactly what DSPM stands for. And that's why we brought Ryan O'Boyle on. Ryan O'Boyle is our senior manager of cloud at Varonis. Ryan, how does the market, how do people like Gartner define DSPM?
Yeah, Matt, it's definitely a newer market that we're seeing. We started seeing this emerge right around Q4 of last year. And when we think about some of these bigger firms and analysts that are really digging into this market, there's really kind of four key pillars that they focus on. First is understanding what is and what isn't sensitive information, and that's going to be dependent on the organization as well. So defining what's sensitive and identifying it or discovering it. Second is understanding which users or accounts or apps have access to data and how much access they have. So essentially monitoring access. Third is the audit side, so understanding which users, apps, identities are actually interacting with specific data sets and what are they touching versus not. And then lastly, is something that's a bit new, but really focused on the cloud side, is understanding the posture of the application that's storing the data. What are the settings or the configurations that are being set up around cloud application, SaaS application, cloud infrastructure. So really, those four key pillars are what we're seeing define the DSPM market today.
Now, when we think about like DSPM, I think one of the things that I'm always wondering is like for everyone that's attending today, where does your organization store sensitive data? Is it only in your on-prem? Is it still pretty locked down? Is it on-prem and in the cloud? Are you cloud first? I wonder if our co-hosts could launch our next poll and maybe we could figure out a little bit of where everybody who's attending today thinks that they store sensitive information.
And Matt, while people are answering out there, I always think it's interesting to think about how we define hybrid cloud as well. Some organizations are thinking about that as a combination of on-prem and in the cloud, or others are thinking of that as a combination of different cloud repositories, different kind of major cloud service providers versus SaaS versus infrastructure. So I think there's a lot of different approaches when it comes to where data could be stored today.
Yeah, and I even think about like data that's sitting inside of an application or data that's being processed. This concept of like inside my four walls, I don't think really exists anymore. And I'm curious to see what our audience thinks about that too. So let's check out those poll answers, but let's also see in the chat, like, can you really even confidently answer this question? I'd be curious to see just a quick yes, no in the chat. Do you really feel like you have a handle on this, like where your organization stores sensitive information?
A lot of yeses. That's great to see.
Yeah, I see a lot of yeses, but also a lot of no's. And I know I asked you, Ryan, like what DSPM means to somebody like Gartner, but I'd also be curious, like what DSPM means to you. Because for me, it's more than just like, where the sensitive data is, who has access to it, who's leveraging that access, and what's my security posture. It's also things like how compliant am I with the various different security frameworks that I'm trying to align my organization to. What else does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. You're really aligning it to the business and maybe the problems that the business faces at that given point, right? It's about starting with kind of a level set, understanding where do we have data being stored. We talked about on-prem versus cloud versus different types of cloud. So, understanding what that ecosystem actually looks like, and then using that kind of mapping of the access, the data, the audit trail side to understand how it actually impacts the business. At least I see. Bob, to your point, you have to think about the different regulations that apply to your business, the different types of data that you might find out there. And then also probably think about the different types of users that are interacting with that data too. Do we have third parties or contractors or vendors that have access to different cloud applications? Or, do we have some sort of internal access or some sort of subsidiary that might have some sort of delegated access as well. So it's not just about understanding the data and the sensitivity and the permissions simply, it's really about understanding, where we're at today in our ecosystem and how that applies to the business and the business processes as well.
Yeah, if I could add to that. So, I think all of us as security professionals or IT professionals always struggle with giving our businesses the ability to, be agile, be very productive. So we introduce tools. With each tool, there is some form of risk. Many of these solutions that are out there, whether it be SaaS, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, they all introduce different levels of risk. Now, with that said, many of the top vendors out there will provide a level of security, and it's called a shared security model. But the organization is still responsible for how they use that and what controls they would put in place. So Matt, you mentioned frameworks. I'm a big advocate of the NIST CSF. And some people will say, well, Bob, that's really, really good for like response or a ransomware attack framework, if you want to leverage that from a identify, protect, detect perspective. But you can also use that framework as a foundation for everything. So as Ryan was saying, visibility into where your data is key. That's the first step. If you don't know what data you have, then you don't know how to protect it. And then when you start moving into regulations like GDPR, like CPRA, whether it be obligations under HIPAA, you really have to understand where your data is. And to be honest with you, with this new agile approach or cloud first approach, we've taken the data custodian, the traditional data custodian that was managed by IT and given it to the users. If the users aren't educated, they're going to take the least path of resistance and they could inadvertently share it out. And then I'll throw one more thing outside there without having visibility. And again, you have your data security posture management, which again, I think someone mentioned, is that a program? It is a program. It's part of your overall security posture. You have to start looking at like, how do you incorporate this program with your DLP and your CASB? Because again, traditionally DLP is looking for that sensitive data that's trying to get out. CASB is looking for those shadow IT, but the data, when someone clicks a setting for external sharing, that starts getting into where, you're having exposure of data. In addition, your offboarding process, when someone leaves the company, who takes over that data and then looks at that data and says, well, how is this data being shared out externally? And am I still a partner with that vendor? Because don't forget, once that share link is out there, as long as they have access until it's taken away. So it's the over permissioning as well.
And I think these are all like really, really great tips, Bob. The other thing I wanted to add on, just to echo your point, a big part of the NIST CSF is being able to properly categorize a system for the level of risk it poses to your organization. And I think that undermines just how important it is to be able to do these risk assessments of all these different places where you might store this information in order to carry it forward. Now, you mentioned something else there, and I want to ask you to expand on it. It's super clear to me that a big part of your role is, data security, data protection, even maybe some data governance elements. Can you expand on that? Can you just talk about like what it's like to be a security leader and having a focus on data, like in your own words?
Challenging, to be completely honest with you. It's always challenging because, from a security professional, you're looking across the entire organization from a risk perspective. That could be the introduction of new applications. We mentioned, when new tech comes in, do you have a strong third-party vendor risk management program? Are you looking at that vendor who's providing that platform and looking at their security posture and then understanding the gaps that are associated with that, and then layering on top of additional security controls? Then there's what I call the BAU. We put a solution in. Over time, workflows get established. I think, Ryan, you mentioned that. Workflows get established. People start finding creative ways of collaborating on these platforms. Having that constant visibility of how, let's say, a particular data set gets uploaded, and then you're getting alerted on it. So, when you start looking at solutions, can they only alert and notify, or can they block and tackle? And how do you actually incorporate that overall strategy of like, well, wait a minute, I've got my DLP in place, I got my CASB in place, but the workflow and permissioning of sharing such data, that's where it really comes down to what we call exposure. Then you have the new SEC rules that are coming down the pike of disclosure. How did this happen if you had a data leak or data breach? So it's really challenging to make sure you got all the boxes checked, but also you have the full coverage of the security posture. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. And I'm going to be a little bit biased with this next question, Bob. I heard from some friends of mine before this Data First Forum today, particularly Jesse. Shout out to Jesse if you're out there. That you might use Varonis to help you with some of these things. Could you talk a little bit about like how Varonis fits into that program?
Yeah, absolutely. So we brought Varonis in for a proof of concept, and I will say that the Varonis team went over and above what we were asking. Our goal was to understand what data was out there, which they did a great job. They also gave me the ability of like, hey, some data could be potentially over permissioned, which was really good. The age of the data, stale data, all this stuff is really important when you're trying to manage the security of data. So we started with the visibility first, obviously looking at what cloud solutions we certainly support right now. And then we started looking at like trying to classify that data. Is that PHI data? Is that social security data? Is there potentially personal credit cards people are storing in their drive? Why they would do that, I don't know, but people will do it. So we started looking at data, and then based on that, understanding the type of data allows you to start looking at a risk profile of like, okay, this is the data I want to go after, because do I have to follow a regulation? If that got leaked out, that's going to be a big concern from a reputation perspective, brand protection perspective, and just overall cybersecurity hygiene. So again, the ability to find it or discover it, identify it, and try to classify it is key. Then once you get to that point, then you start building the strategy of like, okay, what data do I want to go after first? What's going to give me the most bang for my buck? What's going to go after my highest risk? So Varonis was instrumental in helping us identify the data that was out there, look to classify it. Like, is it PHI? Is it SPI? Is it any kind of PI or intellectual property or business confidential? So again, starting at that point of discovery, then identifying the data types, and then you can put your strategy together to go after it. So shortening it, yeah, that's exactly the approach we've taken, and Varonis has been a great partner in helping us do this.
And I think, just three things I wanted you to expand on. We talked a little bit about external threats. We talked about internal threats, but one thing that you brought up was also like the threat of regulatory risk. Can you talk a little bit about how you're balancing those three?
So we have a pretty good data privacy and compliance team. So we're constantly looking at just the overall understanding of how WW processes personal information. So I'll take that regulatory as one subject. Now we're shifting our view into, okay, well, we understand what the rules are, but now how are people processing it? And again, when you start looking at data privacy, you're looking at, data impact assessments, you're looking at areas that might be considered risky. So, you try to follow within the GDPR rules or another data privacy rule set. It's really going after how that data is being stored out. And again, is it being stored out, or I'm sorry, shared out to an unauthorized individual? And that's where, again, I'll mention that the days of IT managing the custodian part of permissions have been given to the user. So now they're taking the ability of potentially sharing out an external link to a partner. But again, is that partner authorized? So this is where awareness starts coming in hand. But again, from a Varonis perspective, visibility and discovery, classification, I'm not talking about labeling of data, I'm talking about just classifying what the data is, and then working with the businesses to make sure that the workflows, that the sharing and collaboration of data is secure, and that they're aware of what they're handling and sharing.
And one thing you brought up there, Bob, if I could ask you to maybe and share as much as you can with us, how does your organization handle that kind of collaboration risk? Like, are end users able to control who can access what data? Does IT control it? Does security control it? Is it audited? Again, just share with us whatever you can.
I would say all the above. You have to give the users the ability to be agile and productive. But you also, then you have to have that visibility, that layer of security of saying, okay, what are you doing in this data? Again, from a DLP perspective, you would get notified that social security numbers were left the organization or got stopped and blocked, and that you would have to notify the business. If the business didn't get the email notification that this has been blocked, please contact the IT department. It's a constant, I want to say cat and mouse, but it's a constant care and feeding of just managing and monitoring data in general.
And when you think about just like this wealth of knowledge and experience that you have in this area, are there any kind of like top 3 tips that come to mind if you're trying to give someone something practical to do based on all this experience that you have on kind of managing data or controlling access? Like, is there anything that you just can't not share to tell our audience today? Some tips you might want to give them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of not trying to boil the ocean. Start with if Varonis is going to be the tool that you're going to use, start with your visibility, understand your data, then identify the risk based on that data type, then put your strategy together. So I would say do it in digestible chunks. If PHI or HIPAA is like one of your main focuses, then go after the PHI data. And I think that's one thing that Varonis is very good, is they're able to identify that data and go, this is PHI. Then you start looking at, again, access, over permissioning, and then, just throw it out there, is there an insider threat that you have to worry about of people having access that probably shouldn't? But again, that kind of all folds into your overall security strategy. But again, the 3 points I would say is understand what you have, discover it, then look to protect it, and then look for a way of detecting anything that would be considered outside your policy. And I'll give an example again, PHI. If your organization says all PHI data will reside here, and this is the departments that will have access, and this is how they're going to share it through secure mechanisms, if it shows up somewhere else on a cloud platform, you've got to be able to quickly respond to that. So let's say your secure FTP is going to be Dropbox or Box for sharing of such data with partners or whoever you have to. If it shows up on a Google Drive, do you really want it there? So again, it's that constant communication with the technology teams as well as partnering with the business.
And Ryan, I haven't. You're another guest star of ours today. I haven't thrown a lot of questions at you. Could I throw that same one at you? Do you have like 3 kind of practical tips? And you don't have to use all the same ones that Bob did, but maybe you could, if you wanted to, you could. But do you have any tips for our audience around, just kind of getting their hands around all that?
Yeah, certainly. I think one we've kind of mentioned, but it's super practical is starting with a basic understanding of what's out there, whether that's a risk assessment approach or just that kind of basic level set to understand what data do we have, what type of data is there, and who has access to it. I'm going to throw that all into one. Step number 2 is then understanding, what are the settings, or as the DSPM market suggests, what is the posture of those applications that are hosting the data? What settings, quite simply, do I have turned on versus turned off? Do I allow people to share out publicly? Do I allow people to share out externally? Do I control which domains people can share out externally to? Can I allow people to create things like organization-wide links in some cases? So get a basic understanding of which applications are hosting the data, and simply which settings are turned on and turned off. And then number 3 is, do I have data feeds to understand what people are doing? Whether that's feeding into a SIEM or feeding into some sort of data lake or central logging system somewhere. Am I able to understand how people are actually interacting with those applications and those data sets, so that I can get a good understanding of, to Bob's point, do I need to detect something, or do I have a deviation, or do I have some sort of potential, suspicious activity that might be going on out there?
And I would add to that.
Go ahead, Bob.
I would add to that you'll be surprised. I mean, I do a lot of CISO events, and some of the conversations we have at the roundtable of like when you go and you venture on a data security posture or program, you'll be surprised of exactly what the organization is using and how they're using it. Sometimes assumptions are made because when it was originally implemented, it was for this use case, but over time, businesses will leverage the tools that you give them. So again, having that constant visibility, to Ryan's point of like, that data wasn't shared externally 6 months ago. Now all of a sudden it is. You got to be able to be on top of that and get ahead of it. If not, then you're gonna be in that cat and mouse game, and you're gonna find yourself in trouble trying to figure out why you weren't on top of it in the first place.
And you guys wouldn't mind if I threw another tip or 2 on top of there, would you?
Go ahead.
I think the first one for me is also, it's really important to have forensics. It's important to be able to go back and say what happened in all these apps and on that data. I can't think of the number of times where we helped a client through an incident and they just didn't have what was needed to complete that investigation.
Yeah, the data origination. Agreed.
Yeah, I think one other thing to keep in mind is, think about it from different perspectives. I think AWS is always a good example. Everybody's always thinking about, what if a bucket becomes public, and my data becomes exposed? That's kind of a really simple example that everybody sees in the news all the time. But what about the flip side of that? What if I have a bucket that's public by design because it's part of an application and needs to be, and somebody accidentally puts the wrong data in there? Right? It's kind of a similar scenario and potentially just as risky, but not always thought of initially. So I think, when we think about these different cloud applications, especially in the cloud, they get really complex really quickly, making sure that we're approaching it from different perspectives, the application layer as well as the data layer is just really important.
One thing I'd also add is to make sure that you have detective controls as well. Ron, could you talk a little bit about like why that's important for us with Varonis to be able to also pick up on, someone impersonating someone else in the cloud, or even someone, using someone else's tokens or credentials?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, part one of that is the detection side, I think, right? Being able to have the audit trail to feed the alerting logic to be able to generate an alert or notification to say, something likely has gone wrong out there, right? That alert notifying that you have a user impersonating another user that's excessively accessing data, or somebody accessing data from a device that they typically don't use day in and day out. So I think that the detection and the initial alert notification is key. But to Bob's point, the second part of that is also I think just as important, the notifications and the understanding of how they're able to do it and what data they actually got to. And we think about the SEC, why were they able to get there and what the actual impact of that potential event could be from a data perspective. So it's not just the initial detection and kind of finding of a compromise or finding a potential insider threat. It's also validating what was actually impacted by that particular event and being able to report on that going forward, so we can adequately alert the proper authorities and have really the proper audit trail in place to proceed with some sort of investigation or breach notification.
Let's actually cover one of those first questions that came in. And Ryan, I'm going to throw this one at you. Someone's putting together a DSPM comparison matrix. What are 5 things that they should include?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I saw this one come through early. Hopefully we provided a little bit more context as we talk through the DSPM concept today. Just a couple of things to think of offhand are, first and foremost, what's the scope? What's actually going to be covered in this DSPM matrix from both an on-prem and a cloud perspective, but what apps are covered? Is it just SaaS applications, or core business critical applications? Are there infrastructure as a service components included as well? So I think starting with the scope and understanding how wide that is, and then number 2 is how deep are we going to go? Is it just surface level posture and application understanding, looking at the settings, or are we going to really start to dive into where I consider more of the important aspects on the DSPM side, the data elements, the type of data that's there. And I think that leads us to point number 3 is, what are the relevant data sets for you? Are there certain regulations or types of data from a compliance perspective that we need to focus on? Or are there certain proprietary types like intellectual property or something that is specific to your business or your organization? And then from there, how do we assess the level of risk based off of access? Is organization-wide access a possibility or something that's allowed in certain areas? Do you have open forums where people can just dump data? Or should there be dedicated areas where you can have external collaboration, or vendors or other third parties, or even maybe clients collaborating with your internal employees? Should you ever have public exposure, maybe from like a marketing perspective, that might be allowed. So number 4 there being understanding your appetite for risk and how much access you can allow in certain areas. And then the 5th one being, do we have the ability to actually monitor or audit or have those detective controls? Can we understand when somebody is accessing data, and how does that impact with the context of the other areas? What type of data it is and how exposed it is. So hopefully that kind of rounds out my 5 key points. What's the scope? How wide are we going from a depth perspective? What type of data do we care about? How are we determining the risk levels based off of exposure? And of course, from there, how do we have detective controls, and how much audit capability do we have around those DSPM components?
And actually, before you give away one of those prizes, I want to ask Bob one other question, which is what makes DSPM any different than any other security acronym?
It's what I would call a very prescriptive approach. You're really getting down to the bits and bytes of data security. Is it part of your overall security posture? Absolutely. DLP, CASB, anything like that. General IT controls or security controls, again, all a big part of your overall posture. What this does from a DSPM perspective is it kind of puts laser focus on the data itself, and that's important. A lot of times we're protecting the 4 walls, or we're protecting access to the system or application. This actually brings it down to the unstructured and structured data within your organization, and that's important. Not saying it's a blind spot, but it's challenging because many companies are data driven. A lot of data, a lot of consumer data. So from a PI perspective, or sensitive PI perspective, or sensitive personal information perspective, where does it reside? And that's a big piece. Again, a lot of conversations at roundtables is I think people are still struggling with that, and at the fast pace of solutions that are being put in to support the fast pace of the business. This is where, again, that risk gets introduced. So you got to be ahead of that risk before it gets introduced, but then you got to be able to monitor and manage that risk. And to Ryan's point, forensics, auditing, all kind of folds into it.
One last question I want to cover, and Bob, this one is for you. A lot of people chiming in. Clearly, you've got some fans, both of your organization and of you here in the chat today. A lot of people want to know what makes it different, likely that your organization has global data security and data privacy concerns. How do you balance the needs of all the different places where you might operate?
So as everyone knows, WWE is a global company. So we have presence across the world. So any kind of cybersecurity or data privacy regulations, we do have to abide by. Obviously, everyone saw the news on Meta getting fined recently, so GDPR, cross-border data transfers, all of that applies to us as well. And then, of course, you have CPRA now, and you have a boatload of states that are either in the process of putting privacy laws in place and ones that already exist. So you have to meet all those requirements. And then, of course, we do deal with WWE performers. So, anytime they get injured, there's PHI involved. So, and we have wrestlers from all over the world. We have people out of Europe. We have people out of Japan, China. All of those countries have their specific privacy laws. And if we fall within those requirements, we have to make sure we meet those obligations. So challenging again, there's a lot of moving parts. And with all the regulations that are coming out from the federal government at the state level, again, you got to stay ahead of it. And that's, again, challenging. So we do our best.
Yeah, it sounds like definitely something that you've managed to wrestle down. Sorry, I had to have one wrestling fun today. Yeah, I had to have one. So I just want to say thanks, Rob, so much for joining us today on this Data First Forum. Thanks to you too, Ryan, all of our co-hosts. And I just want to remind everyone, these events are made possible by you, our audience. We really appreciate you and your engagement. So thank you so much for coming. And we look forward to seeing you on the next Data First Forum.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks all.